Yeah, so Elizabeth says, I carry the sickle cell trait. Is that the reason why I suffer from chronic anemia? It's hard to say, Elizabeth, because just because you carry the sickle cell trait doesn't necessarily mean that your cells are sickle shaped, and that's where you'd want to get what's called a morphology test. So ask your doctor to do morphology. Morphology just refers to what's the shape of your red blood cells. Are the red blood cells abnormally shaped? Are they sickle shaped? If you do morphology and you see sickle shaped red blood cells, then the answer is yes. If you do morphology and you don't see sickle shaped blood cells, then you've got anemia for a different reason. Can destruction of parietal cells also cause ulcers? Judith wants to know. Yes, remember, destruction of the stomach lining, the tissue itself, once you break through that mucosal layer and you start damaging the cells underneath, you run the risk of the development of ulcers, so absolutely. So what does it mean to have normocytic normochromic anemia? I can't see the rest of the question. When does that happen? So normocytic normochromic anemia is, so you can have normal shaped and normal colored red blood cells. So your MCV and your MCH and your MCHC could all be completely normal, but you're still iron deficient. And you can still be anemic. So that's one example of having an iron deficiency can cause normocytic normochromic, so can a vitamin B6 deficiency. So there are different things that definitely can contribute to normal looking red blood cells and normal colored red blood cells, even though they're not functioning fully. Isn't a high ferritin level indicative of cancer? Jane wants to know. Not necessarily. I mean, high ferritin. So ferritin, when it's elevated, is a marker for inflammation. It's known as an acute phase reactant protein. So when the body's super chronically inflamed, we'll see if ferritin levels climb really, really high. And so iron, now, is cancer a disease of inflammation? Yes. Can people with cancer have high ferritin? Yes. Does having high ferritin mean you have cancer? No. You could have high ferritin for a number of different reasons. Again, it's a marker for inflammation more than it's a kind of a marker directly for cancer. Let's see, wanting to do more intermittent fasting, plus 24-hour fast. How do you maintain your weight? I don't want to lose more weight, female 5'8", 143. Would 135 to 130 be too skinny? I feel small. Look, I can't answer that question specifically without actually measuring your body fat composition, because weight is relative. I mean, you can have a person who's thin but has high levels of body fat and that we would call skinny fat. You can also have a person that appears obese on paper, but because they're so well muscled, their body mass index is high, but because they're well muscled, they're not really. But again, if you're trying to discern what your weight should be, there's not like a magic perfect number there. I think you have to be comfortable in your own skin first and foremost. But where we look to see with fasting creating a problem is if you're losing muscle. If you're losing muscle mass, if you're muscle wasting, that's where the problem really starts to set in. You don't want to fast to the point that your body is eating into your muscle, into your protein, to basically catabolizing your body to generate and drive energy production. That's when you've gone and taken it too far. Let's see here. How long can it take for the body to heal from gluten damage after stopping gluten completely, still struggling with the anemia symptoms, fatigue, weakness, exercise intolerance, and lethargy? That's a good question, Tamara, and it's different for different people. But as a general rule of thumb, if the diet is really dialed in and there aren't any other problems and everything is what it should be in terms of nutrition, to heal the damage that's caused by gluten, 18 months to 3 years fully for recovery, because part of that depends on how long you've been eating gluten. So like if you've been eating gluten your whole life, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you don't heal that in 6 months. You're not going to take 30 or 40 years of damage and correct it in 6 months. The body's dynamic, but in many cases it needs multiple cellular turnover in order to fully get restorative strength back to it. So I don't want to give you an exact answer. I apologize, I can't do that, but because everybody's different. But 18 months to 3 years, depending on other variables as well. Dr. Osborne, please help. I have pelvic organ prolapse. So you got a prolapse, I'm going to assume prolapse uterus. I'm in so much pain, I need advice. You need to get with if it is a uterine prolapse, you need to get with somebody who specializes in the physical therapy and the rehab around that, because there may be some muscular issues that need to be addressed. A lot of times when women have that issue, it's muscular atrophy in those pelvic muscles, and that requires a specific set of types of exercises. And so I would just encourage you to follow up with an expert who specializes in pelvic floor exercises. Just look that term up, pelvic floor expert, and find somebody who might be able to help you there. Now, there could be some other biochemical issues that have led to some of that, and that's something you'd want to get with somebody who's really well equipped with nutrition to help you understand that and navigate that a little easier. Star says, my husband is on his second round of iron infusions. Excited to see this live. Glad you're here, Star. Yeah, hopefully you'll take away a lot of value from what we've talked about tonight for your husband. What does DQ8 homozygosity, the question doesn't make sense. What is DQ8 homozygosity is present? I think you maybe meant to say, what if DQ8 homozygosity is present? What does that mean on labs? If you're double DQ8, it basically means that you have the genes for gluten sensitivity, and then if you eat gluten, then genetically speaking, your body is going to react to that gluten consumption by producing an inflammatory cascade that leads to damage over time. So people that have positive genetic markers for gluten sensitivity, in my opinion, should not be consuming gluten unless you want to induce inflammation. So the double DQ8 like that, those are both gluten-sensitive markers or genetic alleles that, again, would predispose you to reacting to gluten in a negative way. Let's see here. Love that, Sherry. Thanks for your kind words. She says, hello from Long Beach. You're my hero. Thank you for giving me my life back. Well, I'm just glad that you took the time to learn. And you got your life back. You just used me as the tool. So thank you for using me as a tool, and get out there and spread the word. Let's see here. Let's see, question about vitamin D megadosing. Yeah, so if you're trying to get your vitamin D levels up, I know a lot of folks right now are concerned with COVID and the vitamin D levels. We just did a story on the news about high dose vitamin D. But yeah, we talked about that. We talked about Whitty. We talked about high dose vitamin D, and I would encourage you to go. We did an entire show on vitamin D, and maybe we can pump that into the feed for you. But if you're vitamin D, if you're high dosing it and it's not correcting, you need to follow up with a doctor who's qualified, because there could be some other issues that are going on, and just perpetually taking high doses of vitamin D might not be a great move for you. Can anemia cause thyroid issues? It can. One of the things that iron is necessary for the conversion of T4 to T3. T4 is inactive thyroid hormone. T3 is active thyroid hormone, and you need iron to make that conversion happen. And so some people have iron deficiency anemia. They have low iron that also is impacting their thyroid hormone conversion. So yes, it's very possible that the two can go hand in hand. So TC's asking about, yeah, I'd mentioned before that for me, I had a chronic cough. That's part of one of my symptoms of gluten exposure. And for me, as far as the chronic cough is concerned, it's gone. As long as I don't get exposed to gluten, I don't chronically cough. I used to cough every night before bed. It was just a non-productive chronic cough. But that was a gluten-induced issue. And I see that a lot in the clinic. I see that with a lot of folks. So oxalates, Barb is asking about high oxalates and anemia. So it's not necessarily that high oxalates cause anemia, it's that when people eat foods, especially people who aren't equipped for the vegetarian diet, when they eat high grain foods or spinach or other greens or plant-based foods that are really, really high in oxalates, oxalate is a crystal structure that can bind other metals. It can bind calcium, it can bind iron, make them harder to absorb. So there is a connection between a high oxalate diet potentially contributing to a reduced ability to absorb the iron in the diet that you're consuming. But it's not it's not that oxalates per se cause iron deficiency in everybody, so I want to be real careful to not tell people to avoid eating any food with oxalate for the fear of an iron deficiency anemia. Can mold and toxins cause anemia? They can, Donna. You remember mold causes chronic inflammation, and chronic inflammation will contribute to lots of different problems. Let's change our color here. But mold kind of really, what it does is it creates environmental exposure to mold, creates an increase in chronic inflammation, which increases demand on nutrient stores. And so your body utilizes essential nutrients to put out the fire. Think of these nutrients almost in a sense as like your fire truck. And if you're chronically inflamed because you're chronically in mold, then your body is going to burn more through its nutritional storage to try to help deal and cope with that inflammation. So for example, one of the things we know chronic inflammation will reduce is vitamin C, right? Vitamin C, why? Because vitamin C is the nutrient necessary to help your body produce cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline, which are how you respond to inflammation. And so longer you have inflammation, the more of your own vitamin C you're going to burn through. Vitamin C has a very short half-life, and if you're not getting adequate quantities in the diet, it becomes very easy to become vitamin C deficient. But in addition, the inflammation itself will drive that process. This is why nutrients are so important. That's why every Monday night you hear me harp on vitamin and mineral status is the number one piece of medical information you could have about yourself. It's number one. It is the priority. It is the foundation of what you need to understand about what's going on first and foremost if you're struggling with a chronic illness or a chronic inflammatory process. Because if you don't have adequate nutrients and you're inflamed, it's very, very hard from diet alone to get adequate nutrition to compensate for the massive level of inflammation to get your body where it needs to go. So understanding that baseline nutritional information becomes very important. Okay, an iron supplement, Elizabeth wants to know. Please suggest an iron supplement. Ultra Iron, Elizabeth. You can check that out over at glutenfreesociety.org. We'll put a link up in the feed for you. And Ultra Iron it's not just iron, it has some of the other factors that are necessary to produce and mature red blood cells. So it's more than just iron. It's a blood building supplement. What do I think of colloidal silver? Depends. It depends on what you are trying to use it for, or what the application is going to be. My daughter was just diagnosed with anemia. Her doctor said to take 220 milligrams of iron. Boy, that's a pretty high dose. Let's see, where's the rest of that? I bought your iron, I bought your Ultra Iron. She has been taking it for a week. She just switched from taking it at night to taking it in the morning, but got very nauseous. Should she just continue to take it at night? Yeah, so one of the things about iron is, especially if you don't take it with enough food, is it can cause nausea. And the nausea can be quite uncomfortable. So anytime you're supplementing, and when I say 225, that's really high. And that may be part of the problem, is that seems like an awful high level. I get lots of folks with anemia, and we generally correct an anemia with anywhere between 50 to 100 milligrams of iron a day. And that's if you've got the diet dialed in, if you've got the inflammatory parameters dialed in, that generally doesn't take more than that usually. So 225, in my opinion, seems a little bit high. Now, that being said, that may be the dose itself may be contributing to some of the nausea, but it also may be that she's just not getting enough food down on her stomach first. So the best way to take iron is to eat, then take the iron, then eat a little bit more. And that way you're buffering that iron like between your food sandwich so that it's not just exposed to the bare stomach or intestine. Serena's asking, what does it mean if iron is okay, but ferritin is on the lower end? Well, if ferritin's on the lower end, it may not mean anything, especially if your iron levels are okay. Now, best thing to do in that type of situation is just to kind of keep an eye on the ferritin, maybe on a 3 to 6 month interval to just make sure that it's not dropping lower. Remember what ferritin is. Ferritin is stored iron. So if your blood iron is okay and your stored iron is okay, even if it's on the lower end, unless you're having really, really heavy menstrual cycles, probably doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot in terms of that in and of itself being an anemia. Anthony wants to know, he's asking about glucose tolerance tests. So apparently in Australia, the glucose drink is made from dextrose, which is corn derivative. My question, is it possible to get a false positive result if you are intolerant, allergic to corn? Is there an alternative test drink that doesn't contain gluten, rice, corn, or soy? And more broadly, can gluten-insensitive people cause blood sugar spikes if gluten is reintroduced into one's diet? Yeah, so gluten can, so that's a lot of questions there, but let's answer the first one. The first one is, I'm going to give you my opinion. The glucose tolerance test is a total waste of time. All right, and this is a test, the glucose tolerance test is used oftentimes, I'm surprised to hear you talk about it, Anthony, is usually done on women who are pregnant, and they do what's called a 4-hour GTT, glucose tolerance test, where they give you, basically they give you sugar that's derived from some type of grain, typically corn, and they give you a massive quantity of this sugar, and then they make you sit there for 4 hours, and then they draw your blood a couple of times, and they measure the glucose response to drinking basically a glass of sugar, which, okay, we should see when you drink a glass of sugar, your blood sugar is going to go up, right? But what doctors like to do in this situation is they like to, with pregnant women specifically, they like to diagnose gestational diabetes. And, you know, it's important to know if you're pregnant and you're a woman, if you have gestational diabetes. But a lot of times, what's the point of running a test? Like, what's the point of doing a test like this? The point would be to make a diagnosis, right? Can you not, well, okay, whether you're a guy or a girl, whether you're pregnant or whether you're not pregnant, whether it's gestational or whether it's just type 2, do you need a 4-hour glucose tolerance test to come to the conclusion that you have gestational diabetes or that you have type 2 diabetes? And the answer is no, you do not need to put your body through the trauma and the stress of drinking corn syrup, especially if you're gluten sensitive, so that a doctor can tell you you're diabetic. And because here's the thing, what if you are diabetic? What's the solution to diabetes? What's the solution? Diet change and exercise. And maybe nutritional supplementation if you're deficient in certain nutrients like zinc or chromium. But that's the solution. So you can get this answer without the trauma of this test, and you can induce diet change and exercise regardless. So like if you even think you're on the fence with diabetes, you should be doing this anyway. So again, the test, you know, ultimately when we run any kind of test, you know, the thought in my mind when I order a test on somebody is, will this test give me information that inherently changes the nature of what we need to do in order to get this person healthy? Will this test hurt that person? Okay, those are questions that have to go through the mind of a doctor, and they should go through your mind too, because if the test is harmful and doesn't really bring any kind of grand solution that you can't already start inducing, then what's the purpose of putting yourself through the 4 hours of stress and trauma and drinking a poison to satisfy a doctor? And that, you know, this very thing happened when my wife was pregnant with my youngest son, who's now a young man. The doctors insisted they insisted to do this test, and I insisted that they weren't going to do the test. And I put my foot down, and they were very upset with me. And I said, "Look, you know, give me a medical waiver. We'll sign your waiver, and we'll move on. And that way, you're not held liable should we, you know, have a diabetic problem that you couldn't detect or identify." But the bottom line was this is super easy. And if we're suspecting any of this at all, we're already going to do this regardless of the outcome of the test. Because if the test comes back negative, but there's still suspicion of diabetes, you're still going to want to do diet change and exercise regardless. So anyway, hopefully that answers your question. Jim, what should we do to heal ulcers? Wow, these questions are all over the map tonight. So if you've got an ulcer, well, you know, ulcers Depends on what's causing it, Jim. I mean, there's H. pylori bacterial infection that can cause ulcer. Gluten can cause ulcers. Food allergens can cause ulcers. Other chemicals in food. Caffeine can contribute to ulcers. Heavy coffee use can contribute to ulcers. The best way to heal an ulcer is to find out what caused the ulcer and to remove that irritant first, right? And then you can do nutritional support and layer that in on top. So you can do things like, we actually have a nutritional support product called GI Soothe. Is one that I would recommend in that situation, where it helps kind of it helps soothe and it helps coat the stomach, so that if you do have an ulcer, that as you put that coating down, it's less irritated by the acid bathing over the ulcer. But ultimately, to heal an ulcer, you've got to know what caused it. So no supplement, no drug, whether it's a proton pump inhibitor or Nexium or something like that, none of that is going to heal an ulcer if you don't know what caused it. They might reduce your symptoms, they're just not going to heal it permanently. Heather's asking, how long after going grain-free should I see an improvement in my ferritin levels? I have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Generally speaking, 3 to 4 months is a pretty good range to see a bump. If you're not seeing that bump, there may be some other type of issue that you don't have quite figured out. So question, how can I get your book? Doc, how can I get your book? Amazon, you can go to Barnes & Noble, you can get it on Walmart, you can get it at Target, but we'll put a link up in the feed for you where you can get a copy of No Grain, No Pain. Anna wants to know, can anemia be related to geographical tongue and Lermite sign? Yes, it can be, particularly geographic tongue. It's not uncommon to see that association. Kalapi wants to know, values of ferritin safe for thalassemia. Again, as long as your ferritin levels are normal, 25 to 90 is a pretty good place for ferritin to sit for most people, whether you have thalassemia or not. That whether your ferritin, in essence, if you have thalassemia, ferritin's important, but it's not the only thing that's important. So don't put too much focused attention on it. Just make sure it's normal when you get it checked out. Can caffeine inhibit absorption? What caffeine does is it's for some people it's a GI irritant. So many people are sensitive to caffeine and it can damage the GI tract lining, and we've known that for a long time. But if you're like the one cup a day drinker of coffee or tea that is caffeinated, most people can get by with that. Okay, where people really get in trouble with caffeine is they're doing like a pot. They're doing 2, 3, 4, 5 cups. They're doing a couple cups in the morning, a couple of cups at lunch, or they're buying the garbage stuff. Like you go through the drive-through, the famous place that most people buy their coffee from. That place, in my opinion, is toxic garbage. You're putting that in your body. You don't love yourself enough. You need to throw it away. That stuff is GMO. That stuff has all kinds of chemicals added to it, and it's sometimes not the caffeine, but it's how the bean is roasted, and it's the other chemical ingredients that they add to the bean so that they can get a consistent taste no matter what franchise you're buying it from. And that to me is scary, having the ability to replicate the taste no matter where you're at in the world. Coffee grown in one soil should not taste exactly the same as coffee grown in another soil. Even coffee grown in the same soil but harvested at different times of the year shouldn't taste exactly the same. And that is very hard to accomplish unless you're adding a bunch of nonsense to it to create that same taste. What can I eat for the iron with no teeth? Kristen, what you can do is you can take liver and you can puree it. You can puree that liver and you can add it to like bone broth or some other type of juice, and you can drink some of it. And it doesn't have to be a lot. You can do a couple of ounces a week to get a good quantity of liver in you that's going to give you some iron. You can also, if you follow more of a plant-based type of diet, you can juice, right? You really more specifically, not so much juicing as pureeing, but you can puree some of those vegetables instead of juicing, and you can get some of the iron that way as well. If you are on a vegetarian diet, one of the ways to enhance iron absorption, in other words, improve iron absorption, is to take vitamin C with it. Now, vitamin C, particularly ascorbate, buffered ascorbate, works really, really well to improve iron absorption from plant-based food items. So that, again, those of you who are vegetarian can check that out. Is there a connection between low vitamin D and low iron? Currently recovering from both and recently gone gluten-free. I mean, there are a lot of correlations, but there doesn't have to be. I mean, so for example, low iron and low vitamin D are very common nutritional deficiencies in somebody with a gluten issue. And so that could be the correlation. It could just be that simple. There are lots of correlations. It could be malnutrition. It could be gastrointestinal inflammation. Remember, nutrient deficiencies don't typically come in singular appearances. They usually come in conglomeration with one another. So I can't recall a time I've ever done nutritional testing on a patient where we found only one deficiency. It's usually a handful of deficiencies that show up. So then that can happen for a lot of different reasons. A person can be deficient because, with vitamin D, lack of sunshine, lack of dietary intake, chronic inflammation, GI inflammation, malabsorption. There's just too many different variables that can cause nutritional deficit to say this is why those two are in a pair for you. Diane, I'm both gluten-free and diagnosed with gastroparesis and had my gallbladder removed. I've been placed on peridone. What is your thought on this medicine since literally eating anything is becoming impossible? I would say you need to be gluten-free for a time, and then you maybe need to talk with your doctor about reevaluating it. I mean, part of the reason why many people with a gluten situation end up, not being able to eat is because their gut's rejecting the concept of eating because it's so damaged. And when the gut's damaged and you put food in it, now it's struggling in a damaged situation already. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of people, intermittent fasting works really, really well, where you fast in this window of 16 to 18 hours and you eat all your meals in this window of 6 to 8 hours. And that way your gut gets to rest. But if your appetite's not great too because of the damage, then that rest allows you, to not just, some people say eat 3 square meals a day or eat 6 small meals a day. Now, one of the best things to make a comeback from chronic gluten-induced gut damage is to do intermittent fasting on a regular basis. I'm a big, big believer in intermittent fasting. As a matter of fact, my own personal life, I typically don't eat breakfast at all. And I work out in the morning. So I work out early in the morning, don't eat breakfast, typically don't eat until around noon or 1. That way I get a good 16 to 18 at least hours of just break from my GI tract. Okay, I think I got that one answered. Can anemia be related? Oh, let's see, I answered that one as well. What do you recommend if one is vitamin D deficient? I got an 11.4 on my test. Depending on the measurement, depending on what side of the pond you're on, because in the UK and Europe, they measure it differently than we do in the United States. But if you're in the US, if you're at 11.4, ideally you want that to be above 50, preferably somewhere around 70 to 100. To get it to that level, depends on your height, depends on your weight, depends on your sunshine, depends on your diet, depends on your level of inflammation. But a pretty safe bet is anywhere between 6,000 to 10,000 units per day to get it up to that level. But if you're going to do that, you really should be following with your doctor and measuring it to make sure that you're not taking too much. I mean, at that dose, it's highly unlikely you'd ever have a problem unless you have kidney damage. People with kidney damage should not high dose vitamin D unless they're being monitored and properly followed. Can low ferritin cause high blood pressure? Well, yes, it can. Anemia can cause high blood pressure. And this is actually in my experience, this is a major cause of high blood pressure so forgive my drawing. Okay, in your neck, we're going to do a frown here because this person's got high blood pressure. You have what are called oxygen or baroreceptors. Oxygen receptors that measure the oxygen concentration coming up your carotid arteries into your brain. So the oxygen getting to your brain, right? If the oxygen coming to your brain is not adequate because you're anemic, then your brain is going to send a message to your heart. And it's going to have your heart increase output. And that means constricting the blood vessels and increasing the pump. And so you get high blood pressure in an effort, you're increasing the pressure to drive more oxygen to the brain because there's not enough oxygen going to the brain. So the high blood pressure can go up. This is actually one of the causes of high blood pressure. Now, not everybody's blood pressure elevation is caused by a lack of oxygen, but this is something, if you've been diagnosed with high blood pressure and your doctor hasn't ruled out anemia, they probably ought to. That's a great question and right on topic. Patrice, I have an underactive thyroid, just been told that I have low folate and have to take vitamin D for life. I don't know why you would have to take vitamin D for life. I mean, to me, that sounds like not good advice. You maybe need to take vitamin D temporarily and get your life squared away to where you're getting adequate vitamin D from the food and your sunshine. I think that one was answered. Let's go down on the right. Yeah, so I think I answered most of those. Can you please explain pernicious anemia and how to fix it? Yeah, okay, we'll take this as our last question of the night because we're 25 over. Lorraine is asking, how do you fix pernicious anemia? Pernicious anemia is a lack of intrinsic factor. And, you know, you got to ask the question why you have pernicious anemia first. So in order to answer the question, we go back here. So again, I was talking earlier about these parietal cells, right? And these parietal cells, they don't just produce acid, but they also produce intrinsic factor. And so what happens in pernicious anemia is it's an autoimmune problem where you're making antibodies that can attack your intrinsic factor. Why is intrinsic factor important? Because when you eat meat or foods that contain B12, intrinsic factor has to pick it up. It's like a taxi cab. They form a complex. And intrinsic factor then carries that B12 down into your small intestine where it's absorbed into the bloodstream. And if you're producing antibodies in an autoimmune reaction that are attacking intrinsic factor, then you don't have adequate quantities of intrinsic factor, so your B12 becomes so low that you develop macrocytic anemia. And if you've got a good doctor and they've tested your intrinsic factor and your antibodies to intrinsic factor, then you hopefully will understand that your anemia is not just a B12 deficiency. It's an inability to properly absorb B12 from the diet when you eat it because your intrinsic factor is chronically under attack. So how do we fix this? Because this is really what needs to be fixed. We have to stop the antibody production on the intrinsic factor. This is an autoimmune process, and to stop an autoimmune process, you have to have 4 things done first. 4. And this is true of any autoimmune disease. But if these 4 things are not done, you'll never overcome the autoimmunity. Thing number 1 is the right diet. And this is different for everyone, but this is testing. Ask your doctor to test you for food sensitivity, food allergy. Ask your doctor to test you for gluten sensitivity. And very, very important. So measuring what you should and shouldn't eat. Number 2, chemical exposure. Adjuvants and vaccines. Heavy metals or toxic metals, food preservatives, food additives, food dyes. Many people react to these chemicals in a negative way, pesticides. So this needs to be measured because if you're reacting here and you can control it, you can change your diet, you can change your chemical exposures. And you can, again, that's step 2 in conquering autoimmunity. Step 3 in conquering autoimmunity is measure your vitamins and minerals because you can't heal without essential nutrients. And let me give you an example. Vitamin D deficiency can cause autoimmune disease all by itself without any other help. And, vitamin and mineral measuring becomes very, very important as a tool for any doctor who's trying to help somebody who's struggling with autoimmune disease because these nutrients are important to regulate the proper reactivity or reaction of the immune system. And then the 4th thing is microbial balance. Microbial balance refers to your microbiome. Your microbiome, if it's off, if you've got overgrowth of certain types of microorganisms or undergrowth of certain types of microorganisms, that can alter the immune system in your gut. Remember, in your gut, 70 to 80% of your entire immune system is concentrated right behind your gut wall and largely influenced by the microbes that live inside of your GI tract. So a lot of times, this is why we'll see autoimmune diseases being induced by things like antibiotics, because it wipes out the microbial balance. So these things all have to be measured. And then once they're measured, whatever is found, right, you have to take action on whatever you find. Because measuring, knowledge without application is wasted. And so you gotta seek this knowledge about yourself, and then you gotta take action on whatever it is. And if you do that, you can say goodbye to that. Okay, that's how you would deal with it. So intrinsic factor or pernicious anemia, again, it's an autoimmune type of anemia that leads to vitamin B12 deficiency, even though your diet may have adequate or ample vitamin B12. Okay. I think that's a wrap. So there's more questions, but I got to go home. I'm going to go home and eat dinner. So look, thanks for spending your Monday night. I hope tonight you learned something you didn't know. That I've done my job if you have. Hey, look, as always, our mission and our goal is to save 100 million lives. And the only way I can do that with all the censorship in the world today, and we get censored every week, is for you to share. If you share this information with somebody you love and care about, it'll reach the right hands, and we'll reach that goal of saving 100 million. So help me help others. As I'm here helping you every Monday night, help me reach other people who also need this help by sharing and caring, because together we can change the world. So I'll see you next Monday for another episode of Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. Hope you have a fantastic week. Hey, if you've got a functional medicine or health question that you'd like me to answer for you, make sure you send me an email, glutenology@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to create a video answer just for you. Have a great day.